there are broad guidelines for reporting news, and those broad guidelines are defined by the Central Propaganda Department. So, and when a specific media to report the news, and we have our specific editorial, which will be consistent with the broad guidelines instructed by the Central Propaganda Department. And so there are broad guidelines, and there are also specific treatments contingent on the events.
So each event had different requirements depending on the
it
department's stance.
It needs the chief editor's judgment of the news, and to the values of the news, and also I think the most important thing is whether the readers and the audiences are interested in this news. And secondly, even if the readers, they are interested in the news, but if the news are not consistent with the broad guidelines or regulations, so it's not appropriate to report the news.
So these broad guidelines and regulations, was this something that was mandated by the Communist Party of China?
Yeah, because the Central Propaganda Department is one of the major institutions within the Chinese Communist Party.
Mm-hmm. So can you think of any specific topics that you weren't allowed to report on at all?
To be honest, as an editor to report international news, there were more space and more freedom to manage the news, because usually the international news are just as reference points to Chinese readers or audience. So they are similarly not so direct to the Chinese politics, and in this way we had more freedom and space to report the international news. But sometimes, like when some events happened in the outside countries, but the events may be very relevant to China, so that should be careful.
So when you have a story that goes against the guidelines and regulations, do you have to modify the story or just completely eliminate it if it doesn't follow these guidelines?
Actually, the editors, even the reporters, the correspondents, they have get used to the these kind of institutions, and they have the awareness, or they have the feeling of which news is appropriate, which is not, and so, in other words, they have the feeling of self-censorship. So self-censorship is the journalists, they screen out the news at the first hand, and so because they already know the broad guidelines, so you don't want to intentionally step on the red lines, right? So you know the boundaries. How can you have the bravery? How can you have the courage to cross the borders, cross the lines? The self-censorship works well within the media, and in the media you have the chief in editor, right? And you have the ordinary editors, and you have the first line reporters. So through meetings and regular meetings, so you realize so what are appropriate, what are not appropriate reporting. And but sometimes the journalists, they may take advantage of not clearly defined boundaries and to report some news. And if the Central Propaganda Department said, okay, how can you report this news? They said, okay, you didn't say we cannot report this news. Right? So actually the journalists, they can maneuver within some space and freedoms.
So then the media material doesn't go through a government office before the public sees it? Nothing like that?
No, nothing like that. Yeah, that's a misunderstanding of censorship. Yeah.
It's a little bit more subtle.
Not more subtle, because there is an institutionalized, specialized, institutes of managing the news, or managing the media system, right?
Okay.
So you don't need government officials to be present in the media organizations to guide you with a band, right?
Yeah.
No, not like that.
So did you have a personal struggle with this when you were working in the news agency? Did you have situations where you really wanted to report on a story that you felt would be very beneficial for the public, but you couldn't because it was against the policy?
I think for the international news reportage, there were few situations like that. For the WTO negotiations between China and the US, right? And so all the negotiations and the clause reached between US and China were not allowed to be published in Chinese media. Actually, there were demonstrated resistance against the clause of China's entry into the WTO. And so the authority worried about the opposition within the country, so they didn't want the public to know exactly and clearly about the clause